Tonight, Pittsburgh holds its breath. In a mansion carved from iron and grief, a war-scarred tycoon silences his doubters with a reckless vow. He will marry the next woman to cross his threshold. The door opens, not to an heiress, but to a seamstress with soot on her hem and courage in her eyes. Whispers turn to shock. Duty collides with desire. And somewhere inside these walls, a locked truth waits to set the city ablaze. What secret will break first? His past, her pride, or the promises forged in steel? Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from, and share this. What do you love most about historical romances? The scandal, the slow-burn tension, or the hard-won redemption? Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, winter of the year, 1881. The sky hung heavy with soot and snow, casting a pale grey light over the Monongahela River. From the windows of the grand stone mansion atop Squirrel Hill, columns of smoke curled into the frost-bitten air, mingling with the steam that rose from the steel mills below. Inside the Voss residence, firelight flickered against velvet curtains and mahogany panels, its warmth unable to melt the chill that clung to the man who stood at the head of the room. Adrian Voss had once been hailed as the Titan of Pittsburgh, the master of iron and bridges, a man forged in the crucible of war and industry. Tonight, however, he stood not as magnate, but as a widower, silent and unreadable, his eyes the color of iced rivers, his presence as still as the snow collecting on the iron railings outside. The parlor shimmered with opulence, gold-rimmed glassware, candles guttering in silver holders, and women dressed in the richest velvets of the season. But beneath the forced laughter and the rustle of silk, tension crackled like kindling. Adrian's board of directors circled him under the guise of social obligation, their voices low, their smiles brittle. "You've mourned long enough, Adrian," murmured one man with a cigar pressed between yellowed fingers. "Society forgets, business does not." "Let them whisper," came Adrian's reply, deep and cool. "The dead are not so easily forgotten." But the murmurs persisted, whispers of weakness, of a legacy without heirs, of a fortune soon to be swallowed by scandal. And then, in a voice that cut through the parlor like the blade of a forge hammer, Adrian Voss declared, "I shall marry the next woman who crosses my threshold. Let that suffice." Gasps rippled like silk torn on a nail. A few ladies tittered nervously. Others stared with wide eyes. And just as the silence settled into scandal, the great oak doors at the far end of the room creaked open. Snow spiraled in behind her like lace torn from the sky. She was no heiress, no debutante, no guest invited to the firelit grandeur of the Voss mansion. She stood in the entry hall in a wool cloak, its hem damp with slush. A narrow parcel wrapped in muslin was clutched to her chest. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her boots scuffed, her gloves worn at the fingertips. Beneath the hood, her face was composed, delicate, almost solemn, with eyes that met the room not in fear, but with quiet purpose. "Forgive the intrusion," she said softly. "I was told to deliver this for Miss Voss." Her hem was undone. Adrian's gaze locked onto her, and something within him, something long dormant, twitched like a furnace newly stirred. She was unremarkable in the eyes of society, but not to him. There was no artifice in her presence, no silken mask. Just a woman who had walked through cold and wind to do her work, never suspecting she would walk into history. A murmur rose behind him. Someone chuckled. "Looks like fate has a sense of timing," drawled a voice. And before sense could catch up with pride, Adrian stepped forward, his voice steady and unshakable. "What is your name, miss?" The woman hesitated. Daphne Ellison." "Miss Ellison," he said, his voice echoing off the panelled walls. "Would you consent to marry me?" The room exploded into disbelief. Daphne blinked once, twice. "I beg your pardon?" "You have entered my house," Adrian said, "and I have made a vow." His jaw tightened. "If you decline, I will not press. But if you say yes, you will have my name, my protection, and my promise that no harm will ever reach you while under my roof." Died. Daphne looked around, as if she might find an exit stitched into the tapestry or hidden behind a candelabrum. But there was none. Only 100 stares upon her, and the unwavering eyes of a man whose grief had made him reckless. She had been raised to mind her place, to speak little and work well. She had sewn wedding gowns she would never wear, dressed society girls whose fathers would never glance her way. She had learned to survive in silence. But this was neither a proposal nor a kindness. It was a test of her dignity, and yet there was no cruelty in his eyes, no leer, only something raw and lonely and proud. "I will marry you," she said, not in a whisper, but with the quiet strength of a woman who has lived on very little and knows the weight of every choice. Within the hour, a solicitor was summoned. Papers were drawn. Daphne signed her name in a hand still chilled by winter. Adrian's signature followed, bold and final. A witness added his seal. The marriage was legal, public, scandalous. Adrian offered her his arm. She hesitated, then took it. The firelight danced on her plain dress, casting it in unexpected gold, and in the stillness that followed, Adrian Voss, master of mills and mourning, walked side by side with a seamstress not chosen for beauty or name, but for the simple, irreversible fact that she had walked through his door. No one applauded. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Morning in the Voss mansion came not with the warmth of dawn, but with the creak of pipes and the distant groan of a boiler stirring to life. Light filtered in through brocade curtains the color of dried blood, but it was the scent of coal smoke, not sun, that greeted Daphne Ellison on her first day as a married woman. She lay still in the wide, unfamiliar bed, its carved posts looming like sentinels over her, its sheets crisp and faintly perfumed. Too clean, too cold. Her modest nightdress clung to her collarbone as she sat up slowly, her body aching from the tension of the night before, though no touch had passed between them. Only a pen, only a promise. The room assigned to her was on the second floor, down a narrow corridor from the master's chamber, though she had not seen Adrian Voss since he'd escorted her up the grand staircase like a gentleman leading a stranger to a stage. Someone had lit the fire in her hearth, but the flames were small, as if uncertain they were allowed to linger. Her trunk had been brought up, the one with her work tools and 3 worn dresses, but it sat untouched in the corner like an artifact from a forgotten life. She rose, buttoned herself into the least faded of her day gowns, a slate-grey wool trimmed with hand-mended lace, and pinned her hair back into the neat chignon that had served her well through long hours of bending, stitching, and biting her tongue. A housemaid knocked once, then entered without waiting. She was young, pale, and visibly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Voss," the girl said, as if testing the name on her tongue. "Breakfast is in the sunroom. Mr. Voss has already gone to the city." Daphne nodded. The title, Mrs. Voss, clung to her skin like a borrowed coat in the wrong size. Not yet hers, not truly. She followed the maid through high-ceilinged halls lined with oil portraits of solemn men and women, none of them smiling, all of them draped in wealth and sorrow. The furniture was dark, massive, more like sculpture than comfort. Thick rugs muffled her steps. Silence ruled here, broken only by the tick of a grandfather clock and the occasional hiss of steam through the old brass grates. At the breakfast table, she met no one. A porcelain cup was poured, a plate arranged, but the servants did not speak beyond necessity. Their eyes slid over her like a curiosity too dangerous to meet directly. She was not a mistress of the house, nor a guest. She was an answer to a dare, a woman pulled from the cold and placed like a question mark in the center of a world that had no room for her. The only one who dared look at her directly was the cook, a broad-shouldered woman named Alma, whose hair was tucked under a muslin cap dusted with flour. "I hear you came through the front door," Alma said, wiping her hands on her apron. "That's something no woman's done here since Mrs. Voss died." Daphne met her gaze and smiled softly. "I didn't mean to cause a storm. I only came to deliver a hem." Alma snorted. Well, you're sewn into something now. The remark might have been sharp in another mouth, but from Alma it carried something else. Curiosity, perhaps even sympathy. It was the first kindness she'd been offered all morning. Later that day, she was shown the room where Adrian's niece Cecilia spent her lessons. The girl, barely 14, sat curled on a window bench, a book in her lap. Her hair was the soft colour of auburn wood, braided down her back with an almost mournful neatness. When Daphne entered, Cecilia did not look up. She turned a page with deliberate slowness, her posture stiff, her presence a deliberate barrier. "I'm not here to take anyone's place," Daphne said gently. "Least of all, your aunt's." No answer came, only the sound of another page turning. Daphne did not press. She simply set down a cup of tea on the nearby table and left the room in silence. By late afternoon, a footman delivered a folded paper to her door, an inventory of expectations, meals, dress codes, guests to avoid, doors not to open. Her presence was to be felt, not heard. Her marriage, though legal, was not to disrupt the routine of the house or the business of the board. She read it without blinking. That evening, voices rose in the drawing room below. She was not meant to hear, but the walls were old, and the doors imperfectly sealed. "We supported your decision, Adrian, because we thought it symbolic, not literal," came one voice, low and brittle. "She's no fool," said another. "She'll keep quiet if paid well. Keep her in modest silks, train her in good behavior, and you'll have yourself a passable hostess." Then Adrian's voice, deep and calm as a distant storm. "She is not your concern." "Everything is our concern," snapped a third voice, sharper. "The company's stocks are strained. Harlan Fisk is already sniffing at your foundries like a hound. He wouldn't hesitate to use this marriage to undermine your standing." Daphne stepped back from the door, her pulse steady, her expression unreadable. But in her chest, a quiet flame was growing, not of shame but resolve. She descended the staircase before she had time to second-guess the impulse. She walked into the drawing room where 4 men stood in coats and waistcoats, glasses of brandy in hand. They turned to stare at her, as if she were an apparition conjured by scandal. "I heard my name," she said with grace so calm it stole the breath from the room, "and I thought it best to address it in person." One man flushed, another scoffed. Adrian straightened, his brow furrowing. Daphne walked forward, not with challenge, but with the dignity of someone who had learned to hold herself like thread on a needle, thin but unbreakable. "I am not here to shame this household," she said, "nor to play the lady, but I can sew, I can keep accounts, I can mend what's torn. If you are worried about appearances, then let me be useful. I won't disappear into parlours and silks, I never have. But I will do the work others overlook." Adrian looked at her then, not with the startled curiosity of the night before, but with something heavier. A man staring at a door he had locked long ago, now cracked open. "You are not required to explain yourself to them," he said quietly. "I'm not doing it for them," she replied. One of the board members cleared his throat. "She has spirit, I'll give her that." "She has spine," Alma muttered from the hallway, carrying in a tray of biscuits. "You gentlemen might learn from it." The next morning, Alma brought Daphne into the workroom behind the kitchen, where the household linens were stored. The space was dusty, the sewing machine idle, the table scratched with years of neglect. "You want to be useful?" Alma asked. "Start here." Daphne rolled up her sleeves and did not hesitate. She sorted fabric, mended pillowcases, and stitched torn curtains with swift, practiced fingers. Before the end of the day, she had repaired 2 uniforms, realigned the hem of the parlour drapes, and altered a dress for one of the housemaids who had never had anything fit properly. By dusk, the servants began to speak to her, not just with civility, but with a glimmer of respect. In the corner of the kitchen, Alma handed her a cup of tea and said, "He may not know what he's done, but you're not just a seamstress anymore. You're in the seams of this house now. Let's see how long it takes him to notice. Outside, the snow began to fall again, quiet, steady, and without apology. And within the walls of stone and silence, the stranger bride began to stitch herself not into society, but into something far more enduring, a place in a house that had long forgotten how to feel. The air behind the Voss mansion was colder than it had any right to be, the kind of chill that slipped past seams and buttons, biting into the skin like regret. Smoke from the chimneys above trailed faintly over the sloped yard, where snow had crusted into greyish ice, cracked here and there by carriage wheels and boot prints. The world out back was a different country, from the house's marble floors and velvet drapes, a world of deliveries, discarded coal, and the whispered rhythm of the servant's wing. Daphne Ellison had come outside to clear her head. The morning had passed with stiff greetings and too many eyes. She carried with her a wicker basket of torn linens and frayed collars that needed mending, her fingers already planning which would be salvaged, which required replacement. Her boots crunched over frozen gravel as she passed near the narrow servant's pantry door, and stopped. Something had moved behind the crates, stacked by the stone wall. Not a cat, not a shadow, a small figure. She approached with caution, heart steady but curious. As she rounded the corner, a sudden scuffle startled her and the figure tried to flee. It was a boy, no more than 10, in a coat too thin and trousers patched with rope at the knees. His face was smudged black with soot, and his eyes flashed wild with fear and hunger. A crust of bread was clutched in one grimy hand, torn in half, as though he'd debated eating it or saving it. Daphne raised a hand, not to strike, not to scold, simply to still him. "It's all right," she said softly. "I'm not going to call anyone." The boy's chest rose and fell in frantic rhythm, as if unsure whether to bolt or collapse. His lips parted, but no words came. "You're freezing," she murmured, glancing at his hands, bare and red with cold. "Come, there's a stove near the back parlour. You don't have to stay, just warm your hands." He hesitated. She took a step back, offering space instead of force. After a moment, the boy followed. Inside, she guided him to a narrow bench near the servant's hearth, where a low fire still burned under the kettle. She poured warm tea into a chipped mug and handed it to him, along with a piece of buttered bread left over from the kitchen's earlier rush. He devoured it with shaking hands, all the while glancing toward the doors, as if fearing discovery at any moment. "Do you have a name?" she asked gently, after his breath had begun to steady. He nodded once. "Thomas." "Thomas," she repeated with a small smile. "Do you live nearby?" He wiped his mouth with the sleeve of his coat. "Nowhere. Not really." Her voice remained calm. "Where are your parents?" His shoulders lifted, then fell. "Papa worked the furnaces at the South Mill. Didn't come back one night. That was months ago. Mama, she died before that. Fever, I think." The weight of his words landed on her chest with cold familiarity. Daphne did not gasp. She did not pity him aloud. She simply placed her basket of linens beside her and reached for a wool scrap and thread. "Can you stay until the fire dies down?" Thomas nodded again, slower this time, lulled by the warmth, the food, the silence that did not judge him. Daphne began to stitch, but her hands were not on automatic. As she worked, her mind wandered to another child in another city. She had been 10 when her father died in the rolling mill fire, his name misspelled in the weekly paper, his body buried under molten beams. Her mother had taken in sewing after that, hemming for the wives of men who earned in a day what she never would in a month. Fever took her 3 years later. Daphne had survived by keeping her head down and her needle moving. Looking at Thomas, she did not see a beggar. She saw herself. The door creaked open. Adrian entered, removing his gloves with precision, his coat still dusted with the soot of the city's breath. He paused mid-step when his eyes fell upon the scene. The boy curled near the fire, Daphne sitting calmly beside him, a needle between her fingers and wool on her lap. "What is this?" His voice was quiet but not kind. Daphne rose slowly. "This is Thomas. He was stealing bread near the back door." Adrian's expression hardened. "Then he should be reported. There's an orphan home 2 blocks down. They'll take him in." "No," Daphne said. The word came without thought, but not without meaning. Adrian's jaw tensed. "He cannot stay. He is a child," she replied, steady. "And he's cold, and he's hungry." "That is not the concern of this house." "It is," she said, taking a single step forward, "when the mistress of this house says it is." Her voice did not rise, it did not tremble, but it reached him in a way that anger never would have. For a moment, the silence between them felt charged, not with rage, but with something older, more intimate, an unspoken question. Adrian looked at Thomas again. The boy, sensing danger, stood with his shoulders squared as best he could, like someone prepared to be struck and planning how not to flinch. Adrian exhaled, slow. "He can stay the night, in the stable, but only that." Daphne nodded. "Thank you." As Adrian turned and left the room, he glanced back once, just briefly, at her, at the boy, at the still burning fire. That night, by the flickering light of a candle and the soft creak of wind through the shuttered windows, Daphne stitched a coat. It was not grand, made from a discarded wool skirt and lined with scraps of flannel, but it was warm, it was strong, and it was his. She worked with the care of someone who had mended lives with thread, not just fabric. In the morning, she brought the coat to Thomas in the stable. He looked at it as if it were gold. Then he looked at her. "Why?" he whispered. Daphne knelt before him and fastened the first button. "Because once, someone gave me a coat," she said, "and it meant I didn't feel invisible." He didn't answer, but when she stood to go, he reached out and held the edge of her sleeve. Not tight, not desperate, just long enough for her to feel it. Later that day, while mending the housekeeper's sleeve in the back parlour, Daphne paused. Her fingers hovered over the needle, her eyes distant. Grief did not always shout. Sometimes it whispered through quiet corners, through coats patched for orphans and fires shared with strangers. Sometimes mercy was not a grand gesture, but a warm cup, a place to sleep, a thread through wool. And sometimes a woman born of silence stitched herself into a world not built for her, not by storming the front door, but by offering warmth where there had only been cold. The mills exhaled their breath in columns of grey that stretched like ghosts over the city. From the frost-rimmed windows of the Voss mansion, one could watch the smoke twist and curl, folding into itself like secrets too long kept. It was a view Adrian had seen 1,000 times, yet lately the smoke had begun to feel less like progress and more like a warning. Downriver at the South Foundry, the night shift had ended in silence instead of its usual clamour. Word travelled fast in Pittsburgh's working quarters, and by the time the foremen had finished their rounds, rumours were already ash among the coal. A rail shipment of refined steel had vanished. Vanished, not delayed. The yard boss claimed the freight had never arrived. The station clerk insisted it had left the depot. Somewhere between shipment and delivery, 12 crates of forged metal had disappeared, and with them, trust. Inside the Voss house, the air was no less tense. In the early hours of that grey morning, Daphne had found Thomas huddled near the kitchen hearth, still rubbing the stiffness from his fingers after a night spent mending horse-tack in the stables. His new coat, though plain, had kept him warm. His face, though smudged, was beginning to lose its edge of fear. She handed him a warm roll, wrapped in cloth, and gently brushed a lock of coal-black hair from his temple. "Eat first," she said. "Then you can tell me what you found." From beneath his coat, he drew out 2 items, a scrap of paper charred around the edges and a small brass token flattened at one end, as if crushed under the heel of a boot. "I found them behind the tool shed at the mill yard," he whispered. "I go there sometimes when it's quiet." Daphne examined the scrap first. It bore the faded remnants of an accounting ledger, columns of numbers, partially burned but still legible in places. One row was marked with the name B. Crawford, the same surname Thomas had spoken in a trembling voice 2 nights earlier, his father's name. The token was stamped with a number, 47, and the letter V. "Was this your father's?" she asked. Thomas nodded. Daphne said nothing more. Instead, she folded both items carefully into a handkerchief and tucked them into her sewing basket beneath layers of folded muslin and twine. Later, while repairing the shoulder seam of a footman's frock coat, she listened. Servants talked when they thought no one important was near. They whispered about the missing steel, about crates switched, men bribed, tools broken and discarded with the handles still warm. She heard the name Latham twice, once in reference to a worker dismissed without cause, and once in a hushed phrase, Latham knew something, then he didn't show. And always behind it all loomed another name, spoken more in dread than in clarity. Fisk. That afternoon, while Daphne organized linen bolts in the workroom, Adrian entered without knocking. His coat was still on, his gloves tucked beneath one arm. His presence shifted the air even before he spoke. "You've taken an interest in the mills," he said evenly. Daphne turned, her hands steady. "The mills are the reason this house stands." His eyes narrowed faintly, not in anger, but in calculation. "And what is it exactly that you're looking for, Mrs. Voss?" She lifted her gaze. "Truth." A silence passed between them, not hostile, but heavy with things unspoken. She did not challenge him with fire, nor did she look away. And that unnerved him more than any outrage could have. Adrian had known many women. Some were cold as marble, others as easily molded. But Daphne stood differently, like a seam held tight, not by force, but by precision. She did not argue. She simply observed. And in that quiet, watchful space, he felt the unsettling suspicion that she saw more than he had ever intended her to. He turned to go, but paused in the doorway. "The board meets tonight," he said. "They'll suggest Harlan Fisk as a potential ally. You may hear his name spoken in this house. If you value your peace, do not ask about him." Daphne held her breath until he left the room. That evening, she passed the closed door of the East Library, the one used for private gatherings. She heard low voices, the clink of glass, the shifting of chairs on wood. She slowed her steps, not eavesdropping, but attuned. "The Fisk Syndicate could stabilize the rail contracts," said one voice. "You need capital to rebuild trust." Another, "He has investors waiting, and his record is clean, for now." Adrian's voice came last. "Harlan Fisk has clean hands because he lets others carry the dirt. I will not shackle this company to a man who poisons quietly." Someone scoffed. "Your pride may cost us the whole line." There was a pause. "Then so be it," Adrian replied. Daphne moved on, her heart pacing fast, but her steps composed. She returned to her quarters and unwrapped the token and the paper. The handwriting on the ledger was familiar, not the script of a laborer, but of someone trained, refined, someone who worked in the office, not the floor. A name came to her lips, but she did not speak it aloud. Instead, she folded the cloth again and placed it beneath her mattress. In the days that followed, she noticed patterns, crates arriving with labels half scraped, invoices rewritten in fresh ink, a clerk who always seemed to vanish before questions were asked. The house's butler, once stiff but polite, now looked at her with veiled concern, as if uncertain which side of the line she stood on. Even Thomas began to notice. "They don't like that you ask things," he said quietly one morning while sweeping the back steps. "That's usually a sign I'm asking the right ones," she replied, handing him a warm scarf she'd finished the night before. One evening, while stitching a torn waistcoat in the kitchen's dim lamplight, Alma sat beside her, silent for a long moment before speaking. "Men like Fisk don't come in through the door. They seep in through cracks. You'd do well to mind the ones in the foundation." Daphne looked up. "Are you warning me?" Alma shook her head. "I'm telling you, you don't frighten easy. But you've walked into a room full of wolves, girl, and not all of them howl." Daphne returned to her stitching, her needle steady, her thoughts anything but. The smoke over the city thickened in the days to come, both in the air and in the halls of the Voss estate. What had begun as whispers grew louder: suspicion, accusation, unrest. And still, Daphne listened. Still, she watched. She did not scream. She did not accuse. She simply sewed and stitched and waited, like a seamstress preparing a funeral coat before the body is ever laid to rest. The first snow of February settled over Pittsburgh like a hush that could not be broken. The mills still smoked, but the sound of hammers and wheels was distant now, muffled beneath a layer of frost that softened even the city's sharpest corners. Atop Squirrel Hill, the Voss estate loomed, its windows aglow but its heart dim, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Inside, the silence was heavier than snow. Daphne stood in Adrian's study, alone. The air smelled faintly of tobacco and old paper, of lamp oil and leather bindings. The room was an inheritance from another century, bookshelves carved in walnut, a globe stained with fingerprints, brass fixtures burnished with time. The fireplace sat cold and unused. She had come under the pretense of dusting, a task no one had asked her to do. What had drawn her in was not duty, but instinct. Adrian spent hours in this room, behind closed doors, often alone. There was no laughter here, no music, only the scratch of a pen, the clink of glass against crystal, and the slow unraveling of a man built for industry but undone by memory. As she wiped down the desk with a clean cloth, her fingers paused over the edge of the center drawer. It did not yield. A keyhole glinted beneath her touch, locked. She did not tug at it, nor did she search for a key. Instead, she simply rested her palm on the polished surface and closed her eyes. Secrets lived in drawers like that, secrets too painful to name aloud. It was not the lock that disturbed her, but the weight of whatever it protected, and the fact that Adrian had left it, day after day, unopened. It was not merely a drawer, it was a wound. Footsteps sounded distantly in the corridor, and Daphne withdrew her hand at once. Later that afternoon, Cecilia was seated in the window alcove of the upstairs music room, pretending to read. The winter light touched her pale hair like burnished copper, though her face remained pale and withdrawn. Daphne entered quietly, carrying a folded shawl she had mended that morning. "You should wear this when you sit here," she said, offering the shawl without insistence. "The draught curls in through the corners." Cecilia accepted it wordlessly. Daphne did not move to leave. "I was told your parents died in a carriage accident," she said after a pause. Cecilia flinched. "But you've never spoken of them. And sometimes," Daphne continued gently, "the way you look at the mills from this window, it's not mourning, it's knowing." Cecilia's lips parted, then closed. Her fingers tightened around the shawl. "My father was not in a carriage," she whispered. "He was in the riot." Daphne remained still. "It was after the iron workers' strike," Cecilia said, her voice trembling with something older than fear. "They said it was over, but a group of men stayed behind near the south gate. My father tried to talk to them. He believed in Adrian, believed he could make them see reason. But someone fired first, and then—" She could not finish. Daphne sat beside her, not touching but near enough to be felt. "Why would they lie?" she asked softly. Cecilia turned her face toward the cold glass. "Because the truth would make Adrian a failure, or worse, a traitor to his own blood." Silence stretched between them, aching and vast. Daphne did not ask more. She already had what she needed. That evening, the dining room was set for two, though neither seemed eager to eat. Adrian sat at the head, his napkin folded with precision but untouched. Daphne sat to his left, her back straight. Her appetite feigned. The candlelight flickered between them, softening nothing. "You were in my study," he said, his voice low. "I was dusting. There are servants for that. I'm not one of them." His jaw tensed. He reached for his wine but did not drink. The fire behind them snapped. "There are things in that drawer you would not understand," he said. "I'm not asking to see them." But you want to know? Daphne met his gaze, steady. I want to understand the man I married. The words hung between them, too intimate for the formality of the room. Adrian stood abruptly. The chair scraped. He crossed to the sideboard and braced his hands against it, his back to her. What would you have me say? He muttered. That I buried my brother beneath the lies the board approved? That I signed the report, knowing the ink was still wet with blood? That the same hands that built this house let him die in a yard of screaming men and smoke? Daphne rose slowly, her steps soundless over the rug. I would have you say, she replied, her voice barely above a breath, that you regret it. He turned, and for the first time she saw him, not the steel magnate, not the man behind papers and walls, but the wounded soul beneath. I regret it every moment I breathe. Their eyes locked, and in that charged stillness something broke. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides. His hand reached for her waist, but hovered unsure. She did not pull back. When his lips touched hers, it was not gentle, it was desperate, the kind of kiss forged in silence and smothered guilt, in the longing of years unlived. She responded, not with fire, but with depth, a seamstress's touch, careful, intentional. When he pulled away, his chest was heaving. Shame flickered across his face like a shadow. I shouldn't have... Daphne's hand rose, not to slap, but to press against his chest. Don't touch me, she said softly, if you plan to forget me. He flinched, as if her words had landed deeper than any strike. She stepped back, the warmth of him still clinging to her skin. Then she turned and left the room, her footsteps firm, her heart steady. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but somewhere deep in the house, behind lock and drawer, something had shifted, something had stirred, and neither of them would ever be quite the same. Pittsburgh wore its February frost like armor, steel-gray skies, sharp winds that sliced through wool, and chimneys exhaling clouds that clung low over the rooftops. The city groaned beneath the weight of its own hunger. At the heart of it stood the Voss estate, regal and silent, its windows shuttered against the cold, its walls thick with tension that no fire could warm. Daphne sat alone in her sewing room, the needle motionless between her fingers. A spool of thread rolled slowly across the edge of the work table, forgotten. In the hours since that kiss, charged, raw and unfinished, Adrian had not spoken to her, not of regret, not of desire, not of anything at all. He had left the dining room with the haunted look of a man pursued by shadows, too old to name, and in his retreat he had left her in silence. The silence did not frighten her, but it did ache. She pressed her fingers to her lips, still warmed by the memory of his mouth, and stood. The hem of her day dress brushed the floor as she crossed the room, her footsteps muffled by the thick runner beneath her boots. Her heart was steady, but her spirit wavered. She had never needed grand declarations. What she needed was truth. That night, Adrian returned home after sundown, the collar of his coat dusted with soot, the scent of coal smoke clinging to his shoulders. Daphne waited for him in the corridor, just outside the study. "Do you regret it?" she asked without preamble. His eyes met hers, tired and unreadable. "Which part?" She tilted her head slightly. "The part where you kissed me, like a man who couldn't breathe without it." He inhaled deeply but did not answer. "I'm not asking you to love me, Adrian," she said. "But if you intend to live in this house with me, with your silence, your locked drawers, and your ghosts, then I need to know who I'm standing beside." Adrian's voice, when it came, was hoarse. "I am a man who built his empire on fire and iron. But the fire burned more than steel. It took things I didn't realize I'd lost until it was too late." "Then look at me," Daphne said, stepping forward, "and tell me what's still burning." He did look, long, deeply, as if memorizing her before turning to ash, but no words followed. She turned from him with a quiet grace and walked back into her room, where the coals in the hearth were already fading to grey. 2 days later, Thomas did not return from the market. Daphne's worry bloomed slowly, first as a flicker, then as a cold weight in her chest. The boy had gone to fetch flour and fabric scraps from the tradesman on Water Street. He was never late, not by a full hour. By the time she reached the market herself, cloak wrapped tightly, boots biting the cobblestones, he had been seen, but not recently. "Ran off near the alley behind the soapworks," said a vendor. "Didn't look right. Some man following him. Tall, dark coat." Daphne's breath caught. She rounded the back alley, her heart pounding. There, crumpled near the brick wall, sat Thomas, his knees drawn to his chest, his breath shallow. His coat was torn at the hem, his scarf missing. His eyes widened when he saw her. "He asked about the paper, the one I gave you." "What did he look like?" she asked, kneeling beside him. "Pinkerton badge," he whispered. "Said I was stealing company property." Daphne gripped his arm. "Did he take anything?" Thomas shook his head. "I lied, said I burned it." She exhaled shakily and helped him to his feet. "You're safe now, come." That night she sat beside Thomas in the servants' kitchen, a bowl of broth between them, the warmth of the stove barely touching the cold in her bones. When Adrian walked in and saw the boy's bruised wrist and the tear in his coat, his face shifted, not in surprise but in fury. "What happened?" "A man followed him," Daphne said. "He asked about the ledger scrap, the one Thomas found at the mill." Adrian said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned, strode into the study and closed the door behind him. She followed. The fire in the hearth had been lit, and for the first time in weeks the room felt alive. Adrian stood before the desk. His hands hovered over the locked drawer, unmoving. "I remember it now," he said, voice low. "The report. It was given to me the morning of the funeral. I signed it without reading." Daphne said nothing, letting the words come. The numbers were off. They said it was an accounting error, that the loss was within expected margins. I believed them, or I wanted to. He reached into the drawer, retrieved a small brass key, and unlocked it. From within he pulled a folder, worn and brittle at the edges. He opened it, scanning its contents. His shoulders tensed as he read. "There are orders here," he murmured, "signed by someone I trusted, rerouting lower-grade steel, using alternate suppliers." His hand trembled. "I thought it was business, small shortcuts to preserve margins. But the weight tolerances, they wouldn't hold under high heat. If that batch went to the southern furnace..." He broke off. Daphne stepped closer. "You think it was Fisk?" Adrian nodded once. "He was an early investor. We dissolved the partnership when I suspected fraud. But I never looked back far enough. If he orchestrated the use of faulty steel, and that furnace collapsed, then it wasn't just sabotage," Daphne whispered. "It was murder, covered by numbers." Adrian closed the file slowly. "If I expose this, the company will fall. Thousands could lose their jobs." "If you don't," she said, "then men will keep dying, and you'll have traded their lives for silence." His eyes met hers, blue ice thawing with grief, with guilt, with something dangerously close to clarity. That night, Daphne returned to her room and sat by the fire, unable to sleep. She picked up a square of cloth and began to embroider, not to mend, but to mark time. Her needle danced through the fabric like a heartbeat. Each stitch was a name unspoken, each thread a burden carried. She did not cry, but her hand trembled. In another part of the house, Adrian stood before the study mirror, his reflection distorted in the glass. He poured a measure of brandy, then set it down untouched. The fire crackled, and the truth, long buried beneath coal and ledgers, had begun to rise. Pittsburgh did not sleep. In the alleys between the mills, men gathered in silence, their breath fogging in the frozen air, their fists clenched not in cold, but in anticipation. The city's iron bones, once humming with pride, now trembled with unrest. Word had passed, not through newspapers or telegrams, but through calloused hands and whispered prayers over empty hearths. The strike would begin at first light. The company gates would not open. Inside the Voss estate, Daphne worked by lamplight, her fingers red from the cold, though she refused the warmth of the fire until every pair of gloves was done. She had gathered scraps from the linen stores, flannel remnants from discarded petticoats, wool from the kitchen's old curtains. What could not be sewn was bundled: logs, biscuits, dried roots wrapped in cloth. There were women in the workers' quarters whose children hadn't seen a warm meal in 3 nights. Daphne would not let them face this uprising with empty hands. Alma sat across from her, threading yarn through a thick needle, her expression a mixture of worry and resolve. "You're doing more than any man on the board," the cook muttered. "I'm doing what I can," Daphne replied. "Aye," Alma said, "and that's why they hate you. You do what they won't." By midday, parcels were ready. Cecilia, pale but determined, offered to carry them alongside Daphne. "They won't expect the Voss girl in the alleys," she said with a flicker of defiance. "They'll expect nothing from us," Daphne answered softly. "That's our strength." Together they delivered bundles to doorsteps with no names. Women opened doors with swollen eyes and nodded without speaking. In return, they gave what they could: dried apples, clean water, silent gratitude. In the church on Partridge Street, Reverend Ellery paused his prayer when he saw Daphne enter with gloves for the widows who scrubbed the pews. "You," he said, resting a hand on her shoulder, "are a woman of hands and heart forged in steel." Daphne did not answer, but in her silence she carried more weight than any sermon. That evening, snow fell again, thin and sharp, like glass crushed underfoot. The house was quieter than usual. Adrian had not spoken all day. He had retreated into the study and stayed there, behind his desk, behind the drawer, whose contents now sat open before him. He had read it, all of it. Every falsified entry, every forged stamp, every payment funneled to a shadow account linked, undeniably, to Harlan Fisk. Every signature not his, but under his approval. Every weight marked as safe that would, under pressure, twist and snap like a neck beneath a boot. And at the bottom of the final page, the date, the day before the collapse. Adrian Voss, a man who had survived war, fire, and empire, sat back in his chair and broke. His hands trembled, his breath hitched, and for the first time in years, his eyes filled, not with rage, but with the unbearable grief of a man who had swallowed too many lies and called it leadership. He heard the door before he saw her. Daphne stood at the threshold, her cheeks wind-bitten, her hair loosened by snow, a smear of soot on the cuff of her sleeve. She looked at him, not as a wife, nor as a stranger, but as the one person in that house still willing to see him whole. "You read it," she said. He nodded once. She crossed to the desk slowly, the flickering lamplight catching the glint of the metal key still resting beside the folder. "Thomas is sick," she said quietly. "Fever, shaking." He called out in his sleep. I sat beside him, and he cried for a father locked inside a furnace. He said he smelled the smoke, that he heard the screaming. Adrian lowered his gaze. "It happened because of that report," she continued, "because it was easier not to look." "I was mourning," he whispered, as if the confession could excuse the weight of it. "I don't doubt that," she replied. "But mourning doesn't erase responsibility. Grief doesn't absolve guilt. And silence," she added, voice low and firm, "is what let this house grow fat while men like Thomas's father burned." He looked up at her then, eyes rimmed with red, but his jaw set. "You think I don't know what it cost? I've carried it in my bones, every night, every name, every shipment I didn't trace, every man I didn't save." "Then stop carrying it," she said, "and start doing something with it." He stared at her. "I need more than your regret, Adrian," she whispered. "I need your courage." His breath caught. For a moment she thought he might speak, might rise, might hold her, might offer something beyond the ache in his chest. But he did not. And she did not go to him. Instead, she turned from the desk and left the study, her skirts brushing the floor like memory. In the hallway the candle sconces flickered. Thomas's cough echoed from the back rooms. Somewhere upstairs, Cecilia played a few hesitant notes on the pianoforte before falling silent again. The house was full of sound, but empty of peace. In her bedroom, Daphne sat before the mirror, her reflection framed in soft shadow. She removed her gloves, slowly. Her fingers were raw from stitching, her eyes tired, but her spine remained straight. She would not beg him for action. She had done her part. The spark was lit. Whether Adrian chose to burn for truth or bury it beneath ash was no longer her burden to bear. But outside, in the streets of Pittsburgh, the blaze was coming, not of fire, but of fury, not of coal, but of conscience. And the Voss name, once carved in steel, would either withstand it or melt in the heat of the reckoning it had long postponed. The streets of Pittsburgh had never been so quiet. It was the silence before the storm, thick and electric, as though the city itself held its breath. The ironworks at Monongahela stood still, their furnaces banked, their fires dimmed, their gates locked against the rising tide of fury. Where once the clang of hammers had echoed, now stood men with clenched jaws and wrapped fists, their breath ghosting in the cold dawn. They had come not with torches or slogans, but with eyes sharpened by hunger and hearts cracked open by grief. It was the 8th day of February, and the city had turned. From the windows of the Voss mansion, smoke did not rise. It hung low, dull and grey, as if uncertain of its place in a world shifting underfoot. Inside the house, Daphne stood at the tall window of the morning room, watching the horizon smoulder. Her hands were clasped tightly, her lips pressed in a line that would not break. Alma entered without knocking, breathless. "They've gathered at the gates," she said. "Hundreds. More coming down from the southern yards. Some are armed. Others are just boys with nothing left to lose." Daphne nodded once. "And the Pinkertons?" "Already stationed. 30 at least, rifles drawn, helmets, batons." "Hired blood." Daphne turned from the window and moved with calm precision. She crossed the hall, pulled her grey wool cloak from the peg, and fastened the clasp at her throat. It was the same cloak she had worn delivering firewood, the same one she had worn into back alleys, to the kitchens of mothers too proud to beg. It was not fine, it was not feminine, but it was hers. Alma reached out, gripping her arm. "You'll be in their line. They already know my name," Daphne said softly. "I will not let them forget my face." When she stepped outside, the cold bit deep into her cheeks, but her spine did not bow. Cecilia followed her down the steps, wordless, pale as bone, her hands clutched around a basket of scarves and bread. The Voss carriage waited but unhitched. Adrian was nowhere in sight. Daphne walked. By the time she reached the South Mill gates, the air was heavy with sweat and smoke, though the fires had not been lit. Crowds pressed against the iron fence, their faces raw with cold and resolve. Among them were women, wives, mothers, sisters, standing shoulder to shoulder with the men. Some held signs scrawled in chalk, others babies bundled in old coats. Steam curled from pots of weak soup at the edge of the crowd. The city's heartbeat thudded not in steel, but in their feet on the frozen earth. Across the yard, a line of Pinkerton agents stood in formation, their eyes hidden beneath brims, rifles resting against their shoulders like extensions of their own ribs. Behind them, mill executives watched from the safety of the platform, expressionless as marble saints. Daphne passed through the gate alone. A murmur rippled through the crowd. She moved not toward the rifles, but toward the cluster of women just behind the front line. They were clustered near the fire barrels, faces turned toward her in a mixture of confusion and wariness. "I come as a woman," she said, lifting her voice above the wind, "and as a wife, and as someone who knows what it is to live in a house built by silence." A few heads turned. "I've seen the numbers," she said slowly. "I've read the names that were never added to the ledgers. I've sat beside a child whose father never came home." She paused, letting her voice carry over the fire. "But I've also seen what happens when fear makes enemies out of men who should be brothers." Her gaze fell upon the younger boys, barely 15, who clutched rusted tools like weapons. "You have every right to your anger, but not every right needs to be used. Pull the boys back, leave the line to the fathers, to the ones who know what it means to break and still live. An older woman stepped forward, her apron damp with melted snow. "And if they shoot anyway, then let them shoot a woman," Daphne said. "Let the world see who they fear most." Behind her, footsteps echoed over the packed ground. Adrian. He wore no coat of velvet, no gloves of leather, only a wool overcoat unbuttoned at the collar, and a face that looked as if it had not slept in days. He stepped past the Pinkertons and onto the empty platform. For a moment, he only looked at her. Then he turned to the crowd. "My name is Adrian Voss," he said, "and I will not let blood be spilled at my gates." The murmur turned to a hush. "You have demands, and you deserve to be heard. But this," he gestured toward the rifles, the fences, the silence, "this is not how we build a city. Not on bones. Not again." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded page. "This is the first document of a formal inquiry into the furnace collapse, into the shipments, into everything." A beat passed. "Signed not by a lawyer, but by me." He turned to the Pinkertons. "Stand down." They hesitated. "I said stand down." The commander signaled. One by one the rifles lowered. The crowd did not cheer. They did not riot. They watched. And then slowly, one by one, they began to kneel. Not in surrender, but in dignity, in defiance that needed no violence. Adrian descended the platform and stood beside Daphne. He didn't take her hand, but he looked at her the way a man looks at salvation and sees his own reflection in its eyes. The night ended not in blood, but in silence, and that silence was sacred, but it would not last. The next morning, Daphne stood in the parlour, the newspaper trembling in her hand. Seamstress turned seductress. How a widow's fortune found a new mistress. The article bore Fisk's fingerprints. It was cruel, slanderous, and expertly aimed. It accused her of social climbing, of manipulation, of sleeping her way into the Empire's future. It named her. It named Thomas. It called her a distraction, sentimental, dangerous, meddlesome. Adrian took the paper from her hand. His jaw clenched. "I'll respond." She looked at him. "No," she said. "You'll rebuild. You'll make truth louder than ink." Her eyes shimmered, but no tears fell. "I've survived worse than words," she added. "Let them try to tear the hem of this house. I'll stitch it back stronger." Outside, the wind blew against the windows like the breath of a city watching. And inside, a woman once thought small stood taller than any name ever printed in bold. It began with a knock that sounded more like thunder than protocol. Daphne stood at the top of the staircase, one hand gripping the polished rail, her heart trembling as bootsteps echoed through the entry hall. Outside, Pittsburgh smouldered beneath a thin veil of ash. Winter still clung to the city's bones, but the fire in its people had not cooled, not since the night at the gates of Monongahela. That night had not ended in blood, but in silence, and silence, as she had learned, had a cost. Adrian opened the door himself. No butler, no preamble. 3 men stood on the stone porch, 2 in government-issued coats, the third holding a leather folder swollen with papers. "The Bureau of Labor Inquiry," the first man said. Adrian nodded once, his face unreadable. "Come in." Within an hour, the house was filled with men in dark coats, their voices hushed but sharp, their questions methodical. They took statements, examined records, and delivered notices of summons. Adrian's board members, those who had once shouted for silence, for compliance, for force, now stammered through testimonies behind closed doors. From the sewing room, Daphne watched it all unfold. She threaded her needle without looking, the soft pull of fabric beneath her fingers steadying her breath. Cecilia sat nearby, not reading, not stitching, simply present, her eyes flickering toward the window every time another carriage arrived. When the arrests began, it was not with spectacle, but with paper. One by one, names that had hidden behind wealth were pulled into the light. Inspectors who had taken bribes, suppliers who had falsified measurements, a clerk who had quietly forged entire shipment logs, but Fisk was already gone. He had left the state 3 nights prior, slipping past the city limits while Pinkertons and political allies looked the other way. The last anyone saw of him was a gloved hand pulling down the curtain of a private rail car, vanishing into the night with all the precision of a man who had planned his cowardice. Adrian did not chase him. Instead, he stood before the inquiry board in the hall of the Carnegie Guild and told the truth. He named names. He recited figures from memory. He did not excuse his silence. He admitted it. His voice never faltered, but Daphne saw how his hand trembled as he passed over the original incident report, the same one he had buried in a drawer for 2 winters. When asked why he had ignored it, he said only, "Because I believed grief gave me the right to disappear." Outside the hearing room, the press waited like wolves. They expected fury, humiliation, disgrace. They received a man who no longer feared losing his name, only failing to make it worthy of keeping. The compensation fund was announced that same week. Every family who had lost a son, a brother, a father in the furnace collapse received a sum. Not just money, but acknowledgement, public, signed and sealed. A memorial was commissioned at Adrian's request. Not a statue, not a gesture of grandiosity, but a black iron plaque to be bolted beside the foundry gate. It would bear every name of the fallen, not just their surnames, but full names, first and middle too, because a man should be remembered as more than a number, Adrian said. It was during those weeks of rebuilding that Daphne's hands found new purpose. At first, it was just a few women, wives of workers, widows, seamstresses out of work after the last tailor shop on Fulton Street had closed. They gathered in the carriage house, brushing the soot from their skirts, bringing scraps of fabric, broken scissors, and quiet courage. They stitched, then they spoke, then they taught. Children who had never held a pencil learned their first letters beneath the beams of that repurposed stable. Cecilia, with her quiet focus and sharp wit, volunteered to lead lessons each morning before her own studies. She wore her grief like a ribbon at her throat, but she no longer let it strangle her voice. The sewing circle became a school, and the school became a promise. One evening, as dusk settled over the slate rooftops and the scent of coal smoke drifted through the shutters, Daphne sat in the parlour, her fingers aching from a long day of mending and measuring. Thomas lay on the rug nearby, curled around a copy of Gulliver's Travels, his lips moving silently as he traced the words with his finger. Adrian entered without his usual weight. He did not carry papers. He did not speak immediately. He only watched her for a moment, the way a man watches a moment he is afraid to disturb. "I saw the new ledger," he said at last. "The girls are signing their own names now." Daphne nodded, setting her needle aside. "With ink-stained fingers and crooked letters. But yes." He crossed the room. The firelight caught the edge of something in his hand, a small velvet box, worn at the corners. He did not kneel. He did not offer speeches. He simply placed the box in her lap. Inside lay a ring, modest but old. The gold was brushed, not polished. The stone was not a diamond, but a garnet, deep red, almost brown in the firelight. "It belonged to my mother," he said softly. "She wore it through hardship and war, through hunger and childbirth, through losing everything and learning how to live again." Daphne's fingers hovered over the band, uncertain. "I didn't give it to you that day at the courthouse because I wasn't offering you anything but silence and protection. I didn't give it to you after the fire because I still didn't know if I was capable of loving someone who could see my shame and not turn away." He stepped closer. "But I give it to you now," he said, his voice catching, "because you turned this house into a place I no longer fear. Because you looked at everything broken in me and chose to stay." Daphne looked up at him, her throat tight, her eyes bright with a pain that was no longer sorrow, only fullness. "I never wanted a name like yours," she said quietly. "I know, but now, it feels like something we've built together." He reached for her hand, not with urgency, not with possession, but with the reverence of a man who had once held power. and found something greater in surrender. She let him slip the ring onto her finger. It fit. Not because it was measured, but because it had waited. Thomas looked up from the rug and grinned. "Do I have to call her mother now?" Daphne laughed, the sound breaking like light through coal smoke. "Only if you wish," she said. "Then I do." The fire crackled. The snow outside melted in thin rivulets against the windows, and somewhere beneath the city's surface the iron still cooled from the last great burn, its strength forged not in heat, but in everything that came after. Ashes. And iron. Spring did not come gently to Pittsburgh. It pushed through soot and frost like green shoots through cinder, determined and trembling. The Allegheny thawed slowly, its muddy waters shedding the last grip of winter, and the hills beyond the mills, once blackened by months of snow and smoke, now held a promise too fragile to name. The city still bore its scars. Chimneys exhaled thinner now, not with defeat, but with restraint. Where ash once cloaked windowsills, now children drew shapes in the dust, and mothers opened shutters wide, letting in the pale light of a morning that didn't carry fear. Inside the Voss house, there was no orchestra. No gowns rustled with taffeta or lace imported from Paris. No silver was polished for foreign guests. Instead, there were work-worn hands arranging wildflowers into mason jars and dresses stitched with purpose rather than spectacle. It was the morning of their vow renewal. Not a wedding, for that had been sealed in silence and law months ago. This was something older and newer, a declaration not just of union, but of transformation. Daphne stood before the looking-glass in the room that had once been spare and cold. Now it smelled faintly of lavender and fresh thread. The dress she wore was simple, yet unlike anything she had made before. The bodice was cut from cloth salvaged from a ruined shipment. Soft grey mill weave, dyed with tea and patience. The skirt had a panel of lace along the hem, frayed, imperfect and precious, stitched from the same bolt she'd used on Cecilia's first commission gown, the one she'd delivered the day her life changed. Her hair was twisted into a low knot, pinned with a single silver comb, borrowed from the housekeeper. Around her throat, no necklace, only the garnet ring at her finger, steady and warm. Behind her, Cecilia tuned the violin, her slender fingers deft and focused. She wore her mother's old shawl, a deep rust colour that complemented her auburn hair, now unbound and brushed. There was a quiet dignity in her posture, no longer a girl hiding behind grief, but a young woman stepping forward with purpose. Thomas, nearly lost beneath his too large waistcoat, sat on the edge of the bed, clutching a folded sheet of paper. He had practiced the reading for days, his tongue stumbling over names both familiar and foreign. Names of men who had died before he understood what death meant. Now he read them aloud like prayers. At precisely 2 o'clock, they walked down to the bridge. The Monongahela Bridge, first of its kind, Adrian's first triumph, stretched above the water like a ribbon of steel and stone. It had survived fire, flood, and ambition. Today, it bore witness to something more enduring. A small crowd had gathered. No dignitaries, no photographers. Only those who had lived the story with them. Mill workers in clean shirts, their wives in aprons still dusted with flour. Widows who had once cursed Adrian Voss now stood holding Daphne's hand. Children with rough shoes and bright eyes craned their necks for a better view. Adrian waited at the center of the bridge. He wore his best black coat, brushed but not new, and a cravat pinned with a button from his brother's old uniform, a quiet emblem of the pain he no longer hid. His expression was solemn, but his eyes shone with something unspeakably tender the moment he saw her. Daphne walked to him slowly, her hand resting lightly on Cecilia's arm. Her steps sure despite the wind tugging at her hem. The steel beneath her feet was cold, but her heart burned. They faced one another under the arch, framed by rivets and sky. No priest, no reading, no ceremony but this, standing before the people they had wronged, healed, and come to love. "I didn't know what it meant to carry a name," Adrian said, voice low but steady. I thought it was something inherited, something defended, but you've shown me it must be earned, forged." He reached into his pocket and took out a simple leather-bound book. Inside it were the new company charters, the amended ledgers, the deed to the school, and a name printed plainly at the bottom, Daphne Ellison Voss, co-founder. Daphne took the book, pressed it to her chest. "I never needed your name," she whispered, "but I'll carry it now, because together we made it mean something." Cecilia lifted her violin. A slow, aching melody rose through the steel beams, low at first, like a hymn hummed beneath breath. Then it swelled, touched by wind and memory, floating downriver toward the smokestacks and spires. Thomas stepped forward, his paper shaking. He cleared his throat. "These are the names on the plaque," he said. "They are not forgotten." And he read. One by one, the names of men who had died in the furnace collapse. Fathers, sons, brothers, some known, some never claimed. Each name struck the crowd like a bell. Eyes welled, hands found other hands. Daphne reached for Adrian's fingers. He laced them with hers, calloused, imperfect, warm. When the reading ended, no one clapped, no one needed to. The plaque glinted in the late afternoon sun, bolted to the foot of the bridge. It read simply, "In memory of those lost not to steel, but to silence. May we never turn away again." Adrian turned to Daphne and leaned close, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. "You turned my house into a home," he whispered, "and my name into something worth keeping." She did not reply. She only leaned her forehead against his, eyes closed, breath trembling. Then they walked, back across the bridge, past fire and ruin, past secrets and silence, past shame, toward mercy, toward memory, toward a love not built in haste or born of obligation, but forged, slowly, painfully, honestly, in steel. The year was 1886, and spring had come early to Pittsburgh. Where once soot clung to every brick and breath, now the hills above the Monongahela bloomed with stubborn wildflowers, pushing through old stone and slag. The mills still roared, but not as they once had. Cleaner furnaces, tighter regulations, fewer funerals. Progress had come, uneven and costly, but real. On the western edge of the city, in a house built from red brick and softened by ivy, Daphne stood at the window of her sewing room. She was 30 now, though the mirror still caught the same wide, steady eyes she'd worn at 25. Only now they were lined at the corners with laughter and something deeper, something that looked like peace. At her work table, a bolt of fabric waited, linen dyed a pale spring green, commissioned by the city for the teacher's ceremony. The school had grown from a single circle of girls into a proper building with a bell and 4 classrooms. Its name was carved in stone above the gate, Ellison House for Learning and Trade. Cecilia was headmistress now. At 20, she carried herself with a quiet elegance, her violin always close at hand, though these days she played less for grief and more for joy. She lived just down the lane with her husband, a printer's apprentice with ink-stained fingers and the gentlest eyes Daphne had ever seen. Thomas was 15, tall and lean as a willow, his voice newly deep and still unsure of itself. He spent most of his days helping Adrian at the bridge yards, though he preferred reading blueprints to managing men. Adrian said he had a mind like a compass, always turning toward true. The boy had taken their name formally when he turned 13, Thomas Ellison Voss. He'd practiced signing it for days. From the nursery came a shriek of delight. Daphne turned, laughing, as a small girl tumbled into the room, dark curls escaping from a crooked ribbon. "Mama," she cried, cheeks flushed. "Papa, let me hold the hammer." Behind her, Adrian appeared in the doorway, stooping just enough to fit beneath the arch. He was broader now, his silver-threaded hair worn with pride, and his smile, once so rare, came easily these days. "She was very persuasive," he said, lifting their daughter into his arms, "like someone I once dared to marry without knowing her name." The girl beamed. "I helped him fix the garden gate." "You helped him drop the garden gate?" Daphne said, crossing the room. Adrian chuckled, setting the child down gently. "She'll be the one to rebuild this city. Just you watch." They stood for a moment, the three of them, framed by late morning light. Outside, a train whistled faintly in the distance, its call less urgent now, more like a promise stretching into the horizon. News had come the week before. Fisk had died in exile, penniless, in a boarding house in Montreal. The papers barely mentioned him. His legacy had crumbled beneath its own weight, a monument to ambition, untethered from mercy. No one spoke his name anymore. But the names on the bridge plaque, those were still read aloud every year, on the date of the furnace collapse. Adrian read them himself, his voice unwavering. Daphne stood beside him always, her hand on Thomas's shoulder. The city had changed. Not enough. Not fast. But enough to make space for the next fight, the next voice, the next girl who would stitch something lasting from the torn cloth of her world. Later that evening, after supper, Daphne walked out onto the porch. The sky was lavender with dusk. Fireflies blinked in the garden. From the parlour, Adrian's voice rose low and warm, reading aloud to their daughter from a storybook worn at the spine. Daphne sat on the top step, hands folded in her lap, heart too full for speech. She had not expected this. Not the house, not the husband, not the school or the child with her fire, or the boy who called her mama when no one was listening. What she had fought for was survival. What she had received was a life stitched with hope. Behind her, Adrian stepped onto the porch, barefoot, a glass of tea in each hand. "She's asleep," he murmured, offering her one. Daphne took it. Their fingers brushed. The touch lingered. They sat together in silence as the stars rose, familiar and new. "I used to believe my name was all I had," he said softly. "Now I know. My name is what you made it." Daphne turned to him, eyes bright. "No, we made it. Thread by thread, trial by fire." He reached for her hand and pressed it against his chest. And beneath the cicadas, beneath the hush of the coming night, the world slowed to the rhythm of breath and memory and a love sewn not with silk or ceremony, but with steel, unshakable, enduring, home. Every love story stitched in silence and sorrow leaves behind more than a memory. It leaves a legacy. Daphne and Adrian's journey reminds us that even from the ashes of betrayal, loss, and injustice, something enduring can be forged. That love is not always born in candlelight or poetry, but in hard choices, held hands, and the quiet courage to do what's right when the world would rather look away. She was never meant to walk through the doors of that mansion. He was never meant to feel again. But life, like steel, is forged under pressure, and what these two built, through mercy, through defiance, through grace, stands tall, unshakable. So, if you've made it this far, I invite you to write "forged" in the comments. That one word tells me you felt this story, that it found a place in your heart and helps us know who walks these emotional roads with us all the way to the end. If you'd like to support the team who brings these deeply human, historically rich love stories to life, feel free to leave a super thanks with any amount you wish. It helps us continue crafting each narrative with care, music, voice, and heart. And if today isn't the day for that, you can still be a vital part of this journey. Share this story with someone who believes in second chances, or who simply needs a little hope stitched into their day. I'm leaving some more powerful love stories like this one linked in the cards above. If this story moved you, I know you'll find more to love there too. Thank you for watching, for feeling, and for remembering that even in the hardest times, love, real love, can still be sewn into steel.